Paris in the middle of the 19th century was not yet the city people imagine today. It was a capital of power, culture, and revolution. But it was also crowded, dirty, tense, and painfully old in many districts. Behind the image of elegance later attached to Paris, there was another city, a city of narrow medieval streets, a city where carts jammed against walls, waste ran too close to homes, and disease spread easily. A city where whole neighborhoods seemed trapped between decay and survival. Then, within a single generation, much of that city was broken open. Old streets disappeared. Entire districts were cut apart. Thousands of buildings were demolished. Wide boulevards pushed through neighborhoods that had stood for centuries. Parks, sewers, stations, gas lamps, and new apartment blocks created a different kind of capital. And not long after that transformation, above the rebuilt city, an iron tower would rise and become the symbol the world now associates with Paris. But before the postcard, before the boulevards were complete, and before the Eiffel Tower, there was another Paris. This is Paris in the age of transformation. In the first half of the 19th century, large parts of central Paris were still dense and tangled. Many streets were so narrow that sunlight barely reached the ground. Buildings leaned over lanes shaped by medieval growth rather than any clear plan. Mud, smoke, waste, and noise were part of daily life. By 1850, Paris had around 1 million inhabitants, and it was still growing fast. People kept arriving from the countryside in search of work and survival. The city had prestige, money, and influence, but its housing, sanitation, traffic, and public order were under severe pressure. Paris was not uniformly miserable. There were grand buildings, elegant districts, theaters, ministries, gardens, and wealthy households. But the city was deeply unequal. A short walk could take you from comfort to overcrowding, from polished interiors to dark rooms with little air and poor drainage. Paris was one of the great capitals of Europe. It was also a city that frightened many of the people who governed it. The memory of revolution still hung over the streets. Paris had already seen upheaval in 1789, 1830, and 1848. Narrow streets were not just unhealthy in the eyes of officials. They were dangerous. They were places where barricades could rise quickly, where troops struggled to move, and where control could be lost block by block. So when the French state looked at Old Paris, it did not see only a sanitation problem or a traffic problem. It saw a political problem. The transformation of Paris was not simply about beauty. It was about power, movement, order, health, and the image of a modern empire. To understand why the change felt so dramatic, picture the everyday city first. You move through streets packed with vendors, handcarts, horses, workers, servants, soldiers, clerks, children, and beggars. Shop signs hang over the roadway. Windows open above cramped passages. Smells mix together. Coal smoke, food, sweat, damp stone, stable waste, refuse, river water. Markets pulse with movement. Church bells still shape the sound of the city. The Seine remains the great artery, carrying traffic and trade through the center. Bridges connect neighborhoods that feel completely different from one another. On one side, you find wealth, administration, and display. On another, labor, crowding, and hardship. Paris already feels important. It is not a provincial town becoming industrial. It is a capital being rewritten. The turning point came under Napoleon III. In 1853, Georges Eugene Haussmann was appointed prefect of the Seine and given the task of transforming Paris. The goal was clear: more air, more light, better circulation, better infrastructure, a more unified appearance. Some of that was necessary. Paris badly needed modern systems, but what followed was massive, disruptive, and often ruthless. The old city was cut open. Boulevards pushed through ancient neighborhoods. Medieval streets vanished. Buildings were demolished in huge numbers. New routes connected railway stations, monuments, government centers, and commercial districts. The city became easier to cross, easier to police, and harder to barricade. At the same time, aqueducts, fountains, and major sewer works expanded the city's capacity to sustain life on a modern scale. This was one of the most important urban reconstruction projects in modern history. To stand in Paris during these decades would have meant living inside a city-sized construction zone. Dust, stone, demolition, scaffolding, surveying, and noise became part of daily life. Familiar lanes vanished. Whole sections of the city were cleared. The Paris many people now think of as timeless was, in large part, the product of this deliberate 19th century redesign. But the rebuilding did not create a simple utopia. The new boulevards were broader, cleaner, brighter, and more regular. Uniform facades created the visual order now associated with Paris. Trees, squares, parks, and promenades changed how people moved through the city. Gaslighting extended life after dark. Shops and cafes benefited from wider streets and heavier circulation. Railway stations tied Paris more tightly to the rest of France. But there was also a cost. Demolition displaced communities. Rising land values pushed many poorer residents outward. Neighborhoods that had once mixed classes became more segregated. Poverty did not disappear because facades improved. It shifted and survived. Haussmann's Paris was cleaner and grander than much of what came before it. It was also a city shaped by top-down power, speculative development, and forced change. Walk in your mind along one of the new boulevards in the 1850s or 1860s. The experience would have felt radically different from the old medieval lanes. The sky is more open. Sightlines run farther. Traffic moves in streams rather than knots. Apartment blocks rise in disciplined rows. Cafe culture expands into the street. Paris begins to feel not just old and important, but modern and self-aware. People can see and be seen in new ways. Public life becomes more performative. The boulevard is not only a transport corridor, it is also a social stage. And beneath all of this lies the infrastructure. Sewers expanded, water systems improved. Public health concerns shaped the redesign even when officials spoke more often about order or beauty. Cholera outbreaks earlier in the century had shown how vulnerable the city was. Crowded housing and weak sanitation were not abstract problems. They killed people. So the rebuilding of Paris was also a rebuilding of what could not easily be seen. The polished surface of the modern city depended on buried systems: pipes, sewers, channels, engineering, maintenance, coordination. But if the city was becoming more modern, it was not becoming gentler. The labor behind this transformation was immense. Streets had to be surveyed and cleared. Buildings had to be demolished. New housing blocks had to be financed and erected. Infrastructure had to be dug and laid at scale. Meanwhile, the city's social contradictions remained visible. Servants climbed staircases in bourgeois apartments while laborers crowded into poorer rooms elsewhere. Luxury shops and elegant promenades existed alongside insecurity and low wages. Paris projected beauty, but it did not erase hierarchy. Observers noticed all of this. Some saw the new Paris as a triumph of civilization. They saw order replacing chaos, light replacing darkness, and grandeur replacing disorder. Others saw authoritarian redesign, social displacement, and an urban vision built partly to suppress unrest. Both views contained truth. Paris in this era is not just a beautiful city becoming more beautiful. It is a contested city being made modern by force, money, engineering, and political will. And while all of this was happening, Paris was also becoming the symbolic center of a new urban imagination. Across Europe and beyond, people looked at it and saw a model. Streets could be widened, infrastructure could be centralized, public space could be reorganized. The city could be planned and redesigned as an expression of national power. By the later 19th century, that image would deepen even further. The rebuilt boulevards, new vistas, railway connections, and public spaces gave Paris a stage on which modern France could present itself to the world. And that brings us to the Eiffel Tower. If you stop the story in the 1850s, the tower does not exist yet. But the conditions that would make such a structure possible and meaningful are already taking shape. The new Paris was becoming a city that wanted to be seen. It was becoming a capital of visibility, spectacle, engineering confidence, and national display. Wider vistas, stronger axes, cleaner monumental framing, a belief that the modern state could reshape the city at scale. The Eiffel Tower belonged to that later confidence. Construction on the tower began in 1887 and was completed in 1889 for the Exposition Universelle, the World's Fair marking the centennial of the French Revolution. It rose over a Paris that had already been transformed by decades of reconstruction. That is why the tower belongs in this story. It was not the beginning of modern Paris. It was the emblem of a city that had already been remade to receive symbols of modern power. And when it appeared, it did not represent old Paris. It represented industrial daring. To many people, that was thrilling. To others, it was offensive. Critics attacked it. Some artists and intellectuals saw it as a monstrous intrusion into the skyline. But that reaction only proves how powerful the tower was. It announced that iron, engineering, and scale now belonged at the center of cultural identity. The Eiffel Tower stood as both a technical feat and a visual declaration. France could still produce grandeur, but now grandeur could be industrial. So when we speak about Paris before the Eiffel Tower, we are speaking about the phase in which the city was being prepared, physically and politically, for symbols like it. The tower was the punctuation mark, not the first sentence. What makes this story so striking is that Paris managed to preserve the illusion of timelessness while undergoing one of the most aggressive urban transformations in European history. People visit Paris now and often feel that it has always looked this way. The boulevards feel inevitable. The façades feel ancient. The views feel natural. But much of that coherence was constructed. It was planned, imposed, engineered, financed, argued over, and built amid conflict. The Paris that people think they remember was in large part invented in the 19th century. It is the moment when a crowded, unequal, politically volatile capital was broken open and remade into one of the defining cities of the modern world. Old Paris did not simply vanish. Pieces of it survived in churches, islands, courtyards, street patterns, and memory. But the dominant form of the city changed. The experience of crossing it changed. The scale of its avenues changed. The relation between citizen and street changed. Standing in Paris at the end of this transformation, you would have seen more than handsome buildings and elegant routes. You would have seen a civilization reorganizing urban life around visibility, circulation, infrastructure, and spectacle. And above that city, by the end of the century, the Eiffel Tower would rise as if to make the message impossible to miss. The modern world was not arriving quietly. It arrived through demolition and dust, through boulevards cut into old neighborhoods, through stone facades aligned in careful order, through buried pipes and sewers, through stations, lamps, traffic, and crowds, through the growing distance between wealth and poverty, through the confidence of engineers and the ambition of the state, and finally through iron rising into the Paris sky. Paris showed the modern world emerging through demolition, planning, spectacle, and urban power. It made modernity look beautiful. If you enjoyed this story, please like the video and subscribe for more historical stories.